All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and today I have a returning guest. It was originally on Purple Pill Philosophy Podcast, but now I've decided to bring him on for the Brass Exchange again. But this time we're going to be talking about a particular topic of interest that we both are into, and it's going to be about biblical history and interpretation, namely about how it influences modern Western culture, namely, like, let's say, America. How are you doing, my good sir?
I'm doing great. Glad to be on the show, and good evening, everyone.
All right. Just for if the audience is living under a rock and doesn't know who you are, can you tell the audience?
Sure thing. I'm Andrew Stratelates. I'm mostly on Twitter nowadays, doing philosophy, apologetics, occasionally cultural critique, and anime stuff, just whatever comes to mind. I know Brass from his work on Purple Pill and Red Pill Religion and Escaping Atheism before that. And so, yeah, I'm a Anglican Christian, and I have a background in philosophy and try to take a philosophical approach to all things.
Yeah, and from last I heard, you're trying to avoid getting your head cut off in a war.
Yes, exactly. So,
Yeah, which is always a good thing to do.
yeah, for sure.
Um, but yeah, I thought this would be an interesting topic to go over because whenever I have a repeat guest on, I try to bring up a topic that we didn't discuss beforehand, and I think that we would both have more interest in. I got the idea for bringing you on or talking about Christian history and the like after reading a pretty good book by, I believe his name is David Torbett, which talks about theology and slavery in between. Uh, it was called, yeah, Theology and Slavery. The basically the battle between the conservative Charles Hodge and the liberal Horace Bushnell. And I got the idea to have a discussion on this um, with you based on that book. And I thought we could go over generally how Christianity has influenced the West.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking about America specifically, and then going broader into the West, both the Puritans and Quakers had a very religious understanding of their colonization in the New World, that they basically felt as though they were on a mission from God to colonize the New World, and took a lot of inspiration from God's covenant with Israel in the Old Testament. And it was definitely a significant factor in how America has made sense of itself, or the American people have, over the last 250 years. And there are, of course, multiple strains, right? There's sort of theological liberalism, which tied into progressivism. There are more conservative elements, including some traditions of very conservative Anglicanism, that came in as well, and it really influenced how people made sense of the political realities that they dealt with. And the West, more broadly, has basically been enculturated in Christianity for 2,000 years, right? Um, the system of governance and that we get from Europe was heavily influenced by the church parish system. the methods of Western ways of doing things, where you hire whoever's best for the job rather than who's your cousin, or who's your best friend's son, and sort of anti-nepotism came from the system of parish economics, where instead of it being all based on bloodlines, you helped people in the parish, and young men and women who were like 15 to 20 in Europe, instead of having to work for a cousin or whatever, they had to like be a hired hand or a maid for someone in the parish, which basically influenced how we look at egalitarianism and economics, um, and really again influence the political and cultural lens and economic lens that the West looks through things.
Yeah. Um, it is actually pretty interesting how it all goes through in Christian history. The book I had read by David Torbett, which talked about how it talked about namely the ultra conservative Charles Hodge and the more ultra liberal Horace Bushnell, and it talked about how, funny enough, like both of them were anti-slavery, but in terms of the American version of slavery, they were both against that, but they sort of had funnier ways of going about it, and each of their ways had unique positive and negative drawbacks to it.
Yeah, definitely. Can you say a bit more of? I'm not familiar with those specific thinkers, so could you say a bit more on what the sort of main thrust of their anti-slavery arguments were?
Well, Horace Bushnell was, and like he was more of an ultra liberal Christian of the day. He was sort of a rival to pretty much Charles Hodge, where they actually had heated exchange of words to each other, and and he's considered the father of modern, you know, like he's considered like the father of liberal Christianity because he's just sort of that prominent. Um, his position on slavery came from his unique um, position on theological interpretations, which he believed that the Bible wasn't really meant to explicitly teach, like necessarily teach literal truths, like in the sense of like actual history, but in many aspects. But it was supposed to do is it's supposed to reach out to the human emotion. It's supposed to be effective, and it's supposed to conform to human emotions.
Gotcha. So sort of like what we'll see today, right? Where it's allegory or story that has a message rather than a document of the actual history that occurred, right?
Yeah. I mean, he did grant that there was historical elements in the Bible, but he didn't think that that was what the like he believed like even in the instances that the Bible did teach about history, that the point was not explicitly to teach history that was in the background of it. It was to conform to like the human emotion and how they build society,
Gotcha.
which
So
yeah,
the history is incidental, basically.
yeah. That was more of his position on it, and what made his position good when it came to the slavery issue, and it's that he he would say, look, he would tell his own people that he was talking to his own crowd that he talked to, the people that he worked with in his seminaries, and he was a minister as well, and he talked to people in his church. He told them, look, if we're going just like if we're going to go completely literal about slavery in the Bible, and there is no, he grants that there is no explicit condemnation of slavery in particular in the Bible. He says he grants that, like if you're going to read it in an ultra literalistic style, he grants that, and he says it would be like he thinks abolitionists that try to go by the literalist interpretation, they're just fooling themselves. He would grant that, but he says that that sort of style is not merited by the Bible because it's supposed to speak to the human emotion. And if it conflicts with that, then you're interpreting it wrong. Like, basically, he would say that if your interpretation of the Bible is making you treat people as lesser than, then you're likely interpreting it wrong.
Yeah, which I can see that as a reasonable heuristic, right? That, I mean, from my tradition, I'd say, special revelation doesn't contradict general revelation, right? So if you think it does, something's wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
And
I
so,
wouldn't, but so go ahead, go on.
yeah, so this this sort of style actually endeared him to many abolitionists because it gave him sort of like he said, yeah, I can't, you know, I can't see how it's never explicitly said that slavery is wrong in the Bible, but that's not important because the message of the Bible as a holistic thing and not just like proof texting individual parts of the Bible. The holistic message is to, love your neighbor and want to treat them treat them good, and slavery clearly contradicts that. And the brutality of slavery is an emotional damage onto Christians and is onto even the Christian slave owners. It's a damage to them emotionally as well. He would say that, and he would say, especially, and that's not even on top of the emotional damage to the slaves. So he would say that, Christians should not have slaves because of just the emotional damage and how much it conflicts with the whole be a good neighbor message in the Bible.
Sure.
Um, so I mean, and that he's taking a more holistic approach. He's not proof texting and saying, "Oh, look, this specific verse in the Bible says that slavery is wrong." He's not
Sure.
doing. He says that that would be foolish to do. He says you have to see it like in the emotional, holistic approach. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, Now, what's funny about Charles Hodge is he finds that sort of look repulsive, because he says you're basically just turning the gospel into basically just a fairy story where there's not like really any literalism in it, and it's just
Right.
whatever moral message you can get out of it. So he was against that, but he wasn't. He was. It was sort of funny because he wasn't so much against slavery. Like he defined slavery more as indentured servitude, and he said in the Bible, like there's nothing condemning that in specific. What he did condemn, though, was American slavery because it has unique features to it that's not biblical, like the racialized elements. And he was absolutely repulsed by theories that contradicted the unity of mankind that he believed in. Um,
Yeah, yeah, that seems relatively typical to like the literalist abolitionists, right?
yeah,
Um,
like so his approach was like Charles Hodge says, well, yes, like the Bible never specifically condemns slavery in the sense it never condemns indentured servitude, but it's still he would say American slavery does not fit under what the Bible prescribed because it was not racialized for one, and two, um, like even in the Bible, the slaves had rights that the South was denying to the slaves, like in terms of marital and parental rights. And
yeah,
Charles Hodge firmly believed that if the slave owners in the South were to be completely biblical and they were to treat their slaves exactly how the Bible prescribed masters to treat their slaves, that they would eventually just have so much cognitive dissonance that they would gradually free the slaves themselves out of Christian love.
interesting.
That was his sort of position on it. Um, so both of them came to the same conclusion, roughly, that slavery in America was wrong, but they came at it through two different theological lenses.
Yeah, and definitely on either end of the spectrum of American Protestantism, right? Looks
Yeah,
like Charles Hodges was this literalist, reformed Calvinist, and Horace Bushnell was a loosey goosey congregationalist, right?
yeah. And well, what's funny about it is that there's this whole typical thing that you do see in many liberal Christianity movements that they would say, well, hey, look, we're so open minded and see how good we are. Well, the funny thing about it is while both men were racist, what's funny is that Horace Bush now was his liberalism, did on the bright side, it did make him open minded, to where he could say, well, he could outright condemn slavery and say, look, we need to abolish it now, not do the whole gradual thing like how Charles Hodge recommended. Um, he could that it did make him open-minded enough to do that and say we don't need to do literalistic readings. But on the other hand, it made him so open-minded that he embraced racialized like theories of anthropology that like Charles Hodge and conservatives considered just blasphemous.
Yeah, and that's the really interesting thing, right? Because in one sense, Charles Hodge um, is less progressive, right? Because he was a gradualist, right? And he wanted to reform the laws in the South and thought that slavery would just sort of consequently end, right?
Yeah,
But but Horace Bushnell, who was the more aggressive abolitionist, actually believed in the racial superiority of whites, right?
yeah,
Yeah, and this is the fascinating thing that you see in the progressives, uh, and it's really interesting because it doesn't fit the way that we see things nowadays, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, what's funny about it is like because Horace Bush now pushed the polygenic theory of man, which held that black people were a completely different sort of species. That
Yeah, a separate origin, right? There were multiple founding populations of humans, right? That
and what's funny is like Horace Bush, like Charles Hodge had said, you can't find that anywhere in the Bible. Everyone came from Adam and Eve. We have one origin, and because Bushnell is so open-minded. He he said, well, it's not about, he wasn't saying about the literalistic reading of it. He said the emotional context to it. And his open-mindedness led him to embrace anthropology about humans that the conservatives, like even racist conservatives back then, did not want to go that far because they didn't see any biblical warrant for it.
Yeah, no, exactly, right. Um, and that's the really interesting thing, right? And it's sort of interesting to see how that anthropology ties into how people look at things, right? And the political consequences as well.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's just really fascinating that that's what occurs, right? And there's a feedback loop, right? Because part of it is actually the people that were making the most money off of the Atlantic slave trade tended to want scientific justification for it as well, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and the funny thing about it is that um, when it comes to Charles Hodge in specific, I mean, for one, he couldn't outright condemn slavery, for his own reasons, because he actually did own slaves himself. So he, um, so he wasn't exactly going to, you know, he wasn't exactly going to bite the hand. Like he wasn't going to make himself to seem out to be worse. So he has sort of a conflict of interest in not condemning it. Um, but what's funny about that is that what's funny about it is that like all the people that were against him, like the theological liberals and even the more pro-slavery people, um, like that, even in the more pro-slavery people that disagree. What's funny enough, they never brought up him owning slaves as a hypocritical point on him.
Interesting, yeah. Doing a little research as I look, it looks like, I mean, yeah, it looks like he basically thought that slavery in the abstract wasn't sinful, right?
Yeah,
Uh, and so that probably is why they didn't claim he was a hypocrite, because he's like, well, indentured servitude isn't sinful.
well, yeah, that and the fact that the reason why they didn't think he was so much of a hypocrite is that he had actually had somewhat of a reputation for actually being a good slave master. Um, where like one of the slaves that he got was at the request of one of the other slaves. It was like a woman slave that he had. Um, she had wanted her son, like she had a child, and she wanted her son back, and so he um bought her son so that the son could be with her, so to reunite them. And and he also let one of the slaves that he had go upon their request. So he had sort of a reputation for being a good slave owner. So neither the abolitionists or anything knew that they could really get at him for that because he had such that reputation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if he just freed any slaves that requested it, um, that, yeah, exactly. And it looks like he basically wanted to change the laws in the South so everyone was obliged to treat their slaves like he did. Is that right?
Yeah, basically. I mean, like, it's not to say that Charles Hodge wasn't a racist. I mean, of course he was. He had the same prejudices that everyone else in his time did. I mean, he obviously wouldn't have gotten the slaves if there wasn't some monetary benefit for him. Um, but what's funny about it is he still stayed true to his conviction in the like even in his contradictory natures, he still held true to his beliefs, like in, say, human unity.
Yeah, definitely, right. And
Even he himself didn't live up to it all the time.
sure.
Um, yeah, and so that is how it's sort of funny. And when you really think about it, like Horace Bushnell, like some people prefer his method because it's more emotionally appealing. Um,
Yeah, well, that's part of like rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is emotional appeals, and emotions are really strong in how we decide things. The issue is they're not always right.
yeah. Well, I mean, his saying was more like if if your if your emotional instincts are telling you that something is barbaric and your interpretation of the Bible is leading you to condone it, then you're reading the Bible wrong. Um, so that was more his position. And what's funny is it allowed them both to be against slavery, but on different terms.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I guess the yeah, and I mean this is the fundamental issue with America, right? In some sense, not answering the slavery question clearly at the founding basically runs into these issues, right? And and part of it too is actually the diversity of anthropology and theology that makes it hard to get a clear singular answer, right?
Mm. Yeah,
Because if everyone was a literalist like Charles Hodge, it would become very clear, right?
yeah.
Uh,
Well, I
but
mean, with many founders, it wasn't so much like people like Washington and Jefferson and the like, they could understand like through moral principles that slavery was wrong. But the problem is that, well, what do you do? Like, what do you do? What comes next? That was their issue because it's one thing to say, well, slavery is a moral wrong, and it's another thing to have a plan in action to actually do something to settle it, and weighing that with other considerations with the people that you're in charge of.
yeah, definitely, right? And I mean that's what happened in the northern colonies and states with John Jay, right? They basically made it illegal to purchase slaves, and um, uh, and eventually it just sort of atrophied as an institution without any radical changes occurring, right? And part of that was because it was so small in comparison in the North, even in colonial times. But but that's the thing when it's like tied to the economy and status and all this other stuff, which it was in the South with cotton at least, right?
Well, I mean, it was all well, it's funny is like we put so much emphasis on the cotton thing, which the South did as well, but it's not like slaves, they didn't teach slaves to do other things as well.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, because there's only a specific season where you can actually do cotton. Rest of the time you know, you have to have another reason to have the slaves. So slaves typically could do multiple things. Like they often build houses. Um they often they knew like basically they had like basically menial labor and like just sort of like the work that no one else wanted to do or
Yeah,
the basically whatever work that would cost more to get like hire someone else to do.
yeah. I guess an interesting counterfactual to look at is what would have it looked like if the America wasn't Christian, but like Islam or paganism or things like that, where it does where even in modern times slavery is permitted, right?
I mean, well, in America, funny enough, slavery is technically not illegal. It just has to happen in a prison.
Yeah, in most states.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what the amendment says. You know, unless you're duly convicted of a crime, you can't be made a slave of basically the prison ward. Yeah. So, and what's funny about it is it does go to the Christian history when it comes to civil rights. Um, what's recently we had Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and what people, funny enough, don't know about Martin Luther King Jr. is that he was very much a theological liberal.
Yeah, that's right. He basically was a Unitarian, or well, he actually resembled the guy we were just talking about, Bushnell, right? Because he criticized like the theology of the Trinity and all of these other things, right? And looked at it as the metaphysical theology and theology he basically dismissed, right? And MLK Jr. um, was from that same sort of strain of theological liberalism, right?
Well, I know that he was skeptical of the virgin birth. I
Right.
know he was skeptical. I don't know if he denied the Trinity full stop, but I know he denied that a physical Trinity, like a physical resurrection, happened. I don't know if he may have believed that a spiritual resurrection happened,
Sure.
but I know that he didn't believe like a physical resurrection happened.
Hmm.
Um, which that does, like, funny enough how, I mean, really the only conservative thing I can really think of what King believed in was when it came to, say, like, when it came to marriage.
Yeah, and he did believe that there was an ordering principle that was above man's laws, right?
Yeah,
Which is very consistent with like a lot of conservative or right wing thought.
yeah. People consider him like more of a neo-orthodox, where he takes a lot of the liberal leanings, but he does have some orthodox foundings to him.
Sure.
Uh, so he's considered more like, I think Karl Barth is where his I can't pronounce his last name. I think it's Barth or something like that.
Yeah, Bart.
Barth, or that thing, his that I think that's sort of what rubbed off on him the most. Um, Although I made funny enough jokes about it, where on Twitter someone said, like, it was a politician, I can't remember her name. I think it was her name was Nina Turner, and she had said, continue Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, um, give black people reparations. And I said, continue Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy, commit adultery and plagiarize your PhD dissertation.
Yeah, his the thing that he was outstanding with was politics. There's a lot of stuff in his personal life that was definitely less than exemplary. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, he wasn't like, funny enough, people call him a communist, but he was never a communist. he associated with people that were communists, but he wasn't one himself.
Yes.
He couldn't. I believe he himself. He said he couldn't be a communist because it was atheistic,
Very interesting.
and he could not reject God.
Makes sense.
So so he stopped short of being. He wasn't a communist. He had some socialist leanings to him. I would say probably if he were still alive today, I would bet he would probably be more of a Bernie Sanders type.
Makes sense. That's a live option for American populism or progressivism, rather.
Yeah, I would see him because what's funny enough, he did do the whole Bernie Sanders thing of appealing to the Nordic nations about
Yeah,
how great they are socially, like in a socialist way. And so he did that as well. Funny enough, all the way back then.
that is hilarious.
So, so yeah, I could see him being more like a Bernie Sanders type if he was still alive today.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, um, I think it is interesting to see how different strains of Christianity get, how they can have different messages to them. I would say, funny enough, the the group that the denomination that had the biggest, like, that were fairly consistent on slavery the most was probably the Quakers, because they had a long-standing hatred for the institution.
Yeah, definitely. And they were very consistent about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sure, some individuals did own slaves, and they didn't necessarily um, always like kick them out of the church for that, but for the most part, they were pretty consistent. Um, and I think that's personally why Thomas Paine was one of the more consistent founding fathers on the slavery issue, because he was basically an ardent abolitionist as well, and he never owned slaves because he came from the theological tradition of Quakerism.
Yep. So he inherited the tendency towards not being consistent on that issue.
Yeah, he was more consistent on that than, say, Thomas Jefferson, because while Thomas Jefferson, he wrote about he wrote about the evils of slavery, he still owned them. Um, so he he was fairly more consistent on that matter. What's funny is, like, Paine was actually pretty liberal himself on some policies. Um, like, he's actually, funny enough, the first example of someone we know advocating for basically a universal basic income.
Interesting.
Like, a base. I don't know if he's. I wouldn't say he was probably the first to bring up the idea. I'm sure if you look up somewhere in ancient past, you probably have someone recommending it, something like it. But he's probably the most notable in American history for recommending it, all the way back in his time. So he had a bit of more progressive beliefs as well. Although what's funny as well is I believe he also shared Thomas Jefferson's belief of decolonization, basically shipping slaves back to Africa or to wherever country would have them. because that was actually a pretty prominent um, a pretty prominent movement that was also going on for a while back then.
Yeah, and that's why Liberia got formed, right?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny, yeah, that was funny enough, like a position that Abraham Lincoln himself held to, and like I remember I talked to a bunch of pro-Confederate people, and they'll say, "Oh, look, that shows just how radical Lincoln actually was because he was pro this whole decolonization product." And I'm like, that wasn't a radical belief back in his time. That was actually the moderate position.
Yeah, it's the American Colonization Society, right?
That was basically, I mean, it was considered the moderate position of the day when you consider like the four groups of people that you're trying to appeal to. One, northern factory workers. Two, pro slave people. Three, the slaves themselves. And oh yeah, and like let's see, I know, yeah, I know four. There is four, but I can't remember number four. But I know that like it was supposed to be a good moderating position because on one hand um it gave pro-slavery Southerners something. It assured them that there would be no revolts against them because that was something that they feared, that
Yeah.
free slaves would come back to fight them and kill them. And so that sort of gave them an out to not have to worry about that. And there were also promises of compensating them for their slaves going away. It gave abolitionists what they wanted because there would be no more slavery. Three, it gave northern factory workers what they wanted because they wouldn't have to worry about their labor being devalued by slaves. Um, and four, for the slaves themselves, it was thought that it was better for them because there was no way in Lincoln's mind, at least initially, that white people would do anything but try to eliminate them. So it was seen as sort of, well, we're just going to just ship them out so that way they don't have to be aggressed upon by violent white mobs. So it had a sort of pessimistic view of race relationships, and but it was pushed as the moderate position of the time, which looking back at it now, like nearly 200 years in the future, like we obviously see a number of problems with it, but back then that was the moderate position.
Yeah.
Mhm. Um, but I think it does go into biblical interpretations of common. It's funny is how you can find interpretations of slavery, how slavery biblical interpretations were used, and you can see that atheists nowadays make the same sort of arguments against the Bible using similar arguments. And I often just appeal to what the abolitionists used in conjunction to it.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the touches on one of the fundamental problems in America and in the modern West in general, right? Is how what does it mean and how should Christianity and the Bible influence society, and what does it mean to interpret it for the new conditions that we're running into, right?
Yeah. Like basically how, like, what are the Christian principles and how do they apply?
Yeah,
Um,
and it comes everything from like anthropology, right? Of what does it mean to be human, or what does it mean to be of a different race or ethnicity?
or
To
what does it mean to be the image of God?
yeah, exactly, right? And what when does it apply and how does it apply, right?
You know, well, what made slavery particularly heinous within America in some instances is that while yes, plenty of cultures way before America was even a thought in anyone's mind, like sure they had slavery then back then, but it was often just seen as sort of a natural fact of life. It was sort of seen like if you oppose slavery, it's like you're opposing air. You're just opposing like a naturally, like if you like Aristotle himself sort of put slavery like it's a natural condition of people, and but made what made slavery a bit more heinous in America in some regards was that while other nations could just see it as just sort of this brute fact of nature, this brute practice of nature that we just do for economic reasons, with them, they believed in the idea of that all men are equal. Well, if you believe all men are equal, the only way that you can justify slavery is by proclaiming that some people that are obviously human aren't actually human. You know, that
Yeah.
some men are not actually men. And that's how the Enlightenment thinkers really went with.
Hmm.
Like, you know, because on one hand, they did not want to give up slavery. That was too embedded in their lives. They did not want to give it up. But on the other hand, they had this belief that all men are equal, which partially has biblical roots and partially has some other Enlightenment roots to it as well. Um, so when you believe that all men are, yeah, and that's how the whole polygenic view comes up, because if you believe all men are equal and you want to keep slaves, well, the only way you can really justify is by having a sort of polygenetic view of man, where some people just simply aren't men, even though they're obviously look it.
Yeah, and that's very dangerous, right?
Yeah, because you know it goes from one hand like where people were like, you know what, this is just like a brute fact of life that we just simply do. It is what it is. Where there's not necessarily superiority attached to it. It's just like brute. It's just in the air, sort of necessity, sort of thing. Versus a more ideological thing where you sort of do have to dehumanize in order to keep it rolling. So I would say in some ways that's how maybe the Enlightenment made the slavery issue worse than it was before in some ways.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, right? And the other thing to keep in mind is in European Christendom, basically slavery had more or less totally disappeared, right? By like the 13th century, I believe,
Yeah,
where there were some serfs, but that was mostly only in like Russia, right?
yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, America actually came pretty late when it came to abolishing slavery. Like when you compare it to other, like the Western nations. Although I will say, in America's defense, it abolished slavery in less time than it took other nations to do it. Like
Yes.
when you compare like America from its founding to the time it ended slave, that was like I think 80 to 90 years. So within like 90 years of America's official existence, slavery was ended. Whereas you had other nations where they had often hundreds of years of head start, and it took them until around that time to end slavery themselves.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it in some sense, it was a weird accident of history that caused the Atlantic slave trade, right? Because I mean, most Europeans' understanding of slavery before that was like the Berbers stealing European slaves or kidnapping Europeans to sell into slavery, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, before, like, you had the ability to travel to distant lands. I mean, the people that you enslaved were typically of the same race as you. Um, so there wasn't really a whole need for a racial hierarchy. Um, it's often what I find funny about people that say we need to get rid of Columbus and we need to get with Leif Erikson.
Yes.
Because like what's funny about like because they say, well, we need to instead of having Columbus Day, have Leif Erikson Day, and I'm like, you do realize that Leif Erikson owned slaves. He killed Native Americans, and he also, saw, he also had a sort of Christian jihadist sort of mission as well to spread Christianity across the lands as well after he converted from paganism. So I mean, so basically, your argument is we need to replace one guy that killed Native Americans for another guy that killed Native Americans.
Well, yes.
So I always found that funny. It's also like funny how they say, "Well, we need to call it Indigenous Peoples Day," but I'm saying, yeah, let's stop celebrating the history of one man that like one, let's say, genocidal maniac, and instead celebrate entire tribes of genocidal maniacs. We're
Well,
broadening we're broadening our scopes of genocidal maniacs that we celebrate. Mhm.
yes. Well, the big issue there for me at least is we always should have more days off, not just replace the ones we already have, right?
Yeah, but I mean, like, I think it's also. I mean, people often can think like, how could any Christian justify slavery? How could any good Christian do it? Well, I mean, like many Christians did, naively, you could say, believed that owning slaves was a way of, like, at least how they proclaimed it. Obviously, like many of them didn't actually believe what they were saying, but like they would proclaim that, hey, look, we need to own slaves because that's the only kind of system where we have full access to the slaves and we can help convert them from their pagan religions into Christianity and save their souls.
Yeah, I mean that happened a little bit. At least my understanding of the typical slave owner in the American South is they kind of just looked at it as a fact of life,
Yeah,
kind of like young men sowing wild oats, right?
yeah.
That they sort of had a boys will be boys attitude about it almost, right? Or a this is just the way things are.
Yeah, but what was funny about it is like they did used to justify the whole, well, we need to capture slaves because and buy slaves from other nations because that's how we can teach Christianity and spread it to these what they call heathens. But they ran into a little problem with that, where they would go to these lands in Africa and they would find Africans praying to Jesus, and so so they would sort because people don't realize this, but Christianity was in Africa long before America was even a thing.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was relatively rare in Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, but Ethiopia was basically one of the first Christian nations, right?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Um,
Augustine himself, I believe, was African.
yeah, Augustine was from North Africa, right? So,
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, what was fun is like so you would have slave owners that would go to these, but they would go to these lands in Africa to get slaves on the like they obviously the whole quote in quote thing in order to save the slaves. Obviously, many of them didn't believe that, and that was just like sort of a post hoc rationalization for something that they already wanted to do. Um, but like, they ran into a problem because they would go to these lands and they would have Africans that were already believing in Jesus, or at the very least had heard about Jesus already because they they were Muslims and thus knew about Jesus as a prophet, or even if they were pagans, they traded with Christians and Muslim tribes around them. So they at the very least had heard about Jesus already. So when the the slave holders came up there, they couldn't really use the justification that they needed to teach these people about Jesus because they had already heard about it, Jesus.
yeah, I'm not super familiar, but that makes sense, right?
So they come
And
up with another justification for it because they could no longer use that excuse.
sure.
Um, what's funny is that in America we don't actually see a big rise in in becoming Christians until like the early 1800s. Like that's when we see like a big rise in Christian converts into like slave converts into Christianity happens like in more or less in the early 1800s. Um, and that has to do with the whole like in the early 1800s there was a big um like what they call it like a big experiential movement going on in Christianity that prioritized like um religious experiences and that sort of broke away with sort of dry enlightenment rationality. um and many like in that sort of environment, like that's the sort of when we get slaves converting to Christianity more, like in the early 1800s.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, slave slave owners would say that the reason why they're doing what they were doing, some of them would at least, they would say they're doing what they're doing because they want to teach um, the slaves how to be Christians. Um, but it's clear that many of them, did not actually believe that because they would make sure that any books in the Bible, like if they had the Bible near in them, they would they would make sure to tear out all the parts that would make it seem like it's okay that they should free the slaves. So they obviously didn't believe that they were actually teaching these slaves how to be Christians. And plus, it was very clear that many of them didn't actually believe that slaves were rational and had souls capable of uh, of being saved. Although I will say that that came more from the polygenetic view, which became rare as a view once Darwin came out.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. What's funny is that Horace Bush now actually, wasn't a fan of Darwin's work either because it went against the whole polygenetic view of man.
Now that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was very committed to that view. Like, but yeah, we've been going on for an hour, and I think we had a pretty good talk.
Yeah, definitely. I enjoyed it, and we touched on a lot of things that I didn't know about, especially with those two abolitionists. And I always enjoy chatting with you, Mr. Brass.
Yeah, I enjoyed chatting with you too, Andrew. It was fun. It was good that we were actually able to do it because I remember this is our third attempt at trying to get this together. The first
Oh,
time, the first time you had scheduling conflicts. The second time I had scheduling conflicts, and now the third time's a charm.
yep, exactly.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, I wanted. Can you tell the lovely audience where they can find you and what projects that you're working
Sure. Right now, I'm on twitter.com/astratalities. I don't have any active projects at the moment, but occasionally I stream and do things on Twitter. So thank you very much.
on? All right. And this has been the Brass Exchange. I had a fun time, and wish everyone the best of days. And this is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.